Welcome to the beginning of our Unit 3 material. This video is the beginning of Chapter 9. It corresponds to Section 9.1, Joints and their classifications. So throughout Chapter 9, we'll be talking about how the bones of the skeletal system linked together in joints that allow movement and also protect the softer internal organs. We'll talk about joint anatomy and how movements provide a foundation on which we can study muscles. Here in section 9.1, we'll talk about a very clear definition of joints and how joints get their name and the general function that all joints serve. We'll differentiate between the four major categories of joints. We'll talk about the three types of fibrous joints and look at examples. We'll talk about the three types of sutures and give examples. We'll talk about the two types of cartilaginous joints and examples. And we'll talk about why joints change as a person gets older. So a joint can also be called an articulation, and it's any point where two bones meet. It can be a movable or immobile interface. Arthrology is the study of joints and joint function and also dysfunction. Kinesiology is the study of musculoskeletal movement. Okay, so when we combine muscle and skeleton, how those two organ systems work together, we get the field of kinesiology. Kinesiology is one part of biomechanics. So generally speaking, the name of a joint comes from the two bones that are coming together. So the radioulnar joint would be where the radius and the ulna come together, for example. We have four different categories of joints. We have bony joints, fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. And we're going to talk about each one of those separately. So bony joints are also called synostosis. Okay? Bony joints are immobile. They are unable to move. And they're formed when a gap between two bones ossifies. And that bone, after ossification is complete, is essentially functioning as a single bone. Okay, so we talked previously that your jaw, your mandible, the left and the right portions were separate bones in an infant, but they become just one functional piece as an adult as that bony joint ossifies. Cranial sutures are another example, and also where the first rib meets the sternum as a person ages, that becomes a bony joint. So another name for fibrous joints is synarthrosis. Okay, so synarthrosis are formed between adjacent bones, and they're bound together by collagen fibers. And those collagen fibers come from one bone and penetrate into the other. And we have three separate types of fibrous joints. We have sutures, gomphosis, and syndesmosis. Sutures are immobile or slightly mobile fibrous joints. And they are formed when collagen fibers bind the bones together. We've talked about collagen quite a bit already, so if you need to review that, might be a good idea. We have three different types of sutures. Okay, so the first is a serrate suture, and a serrate suture is a jagged line. Okay, and if we were to make an analogy to woodworking, this would be like a dovetail joint. It's a jagged line, and we can see this in the coronal suture or the squamous suture or the lambdoidal suture that we have here in the skull. And then we have lap sutures, and lap sutures are kind of at an angle considering the depth of the bone, at an angle through the depth of the bone, kind of like a miter joint in woodworking. So where the temporal and parietal bones meet, this is a lap suture. And finally, a plain suture is where it's pretty much just two pieces squared up that are fused together end to end. So the palatine process of the maxillae is an example of this. So the roof of your mouth, that palatine bone there, they are fused together in a fairly squared up arrangement. Gomphosis is fibrous joints, specifically attaching the tooth into the socket. So teeth are held in place by the fibrous periodontal ligament, and these are collagen fibers that are attaching teeth to the jawbone. We can see these collagen fibers. Here's our mandible, portion of the mandible, and attaching here to the root of the tooth. So this is a slightly flexible joint, and that flexibility allows the tooth to give just a little bit as we're chewing and putting stress on those teeth. All right, finally, our last fibrous joint is a syndesmosis. Okay, syndesmosis is when two bones are bound by these long collagen connective fibers. Okay, so this makes a very mobile joint in some cases and a less mobile joint in other cases. Okay, so when we have an attachment between the radius and the ulna, this allows the radius and ulna to move somewhat freely at the elbow end. These can also be less mobile, as in the case of the tibia and fibula. They don't move very much in this particular type of joint. So next we're going to talk about cartilaginous joints. Okay, another name for this is the amphiarthrosis, and these are two bones that are linked by cartilage. We have two different types here. We have synchondrosis and symphysis. So synchondrosis are bones that are joined by that hyaline cartilage. Okay, so this is a temporary joint in the case of some of the epiphyseal plates in children. And it can also be a more permanent attachment, for example, when the first rib attaches to the sternum. And again, we talked about over a very long time as a person ages, this can become a bony joint. Symphysis is when two bones are linked together by fibrocartilage. Okay, so two good examples of this, the pubic symphysis at the front of the pelvic bones, where the left and the right join together, we have something called the interpubic disc. And another good example of this is the vertebra being linked by the intervertebral discs. So here are examples of slight movements, more of a cushioning effect, and a slight degree of flexibility in the case of the intervertebral disc. Each one of these 23 discs slightly flexible, but overall it gives a fair amount of flexibility.